And there, in the first place, they frame and take the oath of supremacy, exalterating Christ and investing his usurping enemy with the spoils of his robbed prerogative, acknowledging the king, quote, only supreme governor over all persons and in all causes, and that his power and jurisdiction must not be declined, unquote. Whereby under all persons and all causes, all church officers and their most properly ecclesiastical affairs and concerns for Christ are comprehended. And if the king shall take upon him to judge their doctrine, worship, discipline, or government, he must not be declined as an incompetent judge. Which did not at once invenerate all the testimony of the fourth period above declared, and laid the foundation for all this Babel that they have built since, and of all this war that hath been waged against the Son of God, and did introduce all this tyranny and absolute power, which hath been since carried to its complement, and made the king's throne the foundation of all the succeeding perjury and apostasy. Yet though, when our synods and presbyteries were not discharged, but might have had access in some concurrence to witness against this horrid invasion upon Christ's prerogative and the Church's privilege, no joint testimony was given against it, except that some were found witnessing against it in their singular capacity by themselves, as faithful Mr. James Guthrie, for declining this usurped authority in prejudice of the kingdom of our Lord Jesus, suffered death and got the martyr's crown upon his head, and some others for refusing that oath arbitrarily imposed, were banished or confined, when they had gained this bulwark of Christ's kingdom. Then they waxed more insolent, and set up their ensigns for signs, and broke down the carved work of Reformation with axes and hammers. In this Parliament, 1661, they passed an act recisitory, whereby they annulled and declared void the National Covenant, the Solemn League and Covenant, Presbyterial government, and made all laws in favor of the work of Reformation since the year 1643. O horrid wickedness, both in its nature so atrocious, to condemn and rescind what God did so signally seal as his own work, to the conviction of the world, and for which he will rescind the rescinders, and overturn these overturners of his work, and make the curse of that broken covenant bind them to the punishment, whom its bond could not oblige to the duty covenanted, and in its design and end so base and detestable, for nothing but to flatter the king in making way for prelacy, tyranny, and popery, and to indulge the licentiousness of some debauched nobles who could not endure the yoke of Christ's government, and to suppress religion and righteousness under the ruins of that Reformation. But O holy and astonishing justice, thus to recompense our way upon our own head, to suffer this cause and cause to be ruined under our unhappy hands, who suffered this destroyer to come in before it was so effectually secured, as it should not have been in the power of his hand, whatever had been in his heart, swelled with enmity against Christ, to have raised and ruined that work as now most wickedly he did, and drew in so many into the guilt of the same deed, that almost the whole land did not only consented unto it, but applauded it, by approving and countenancing another wicked act, framed at the same time by that same perfidious Parliament for the anniversary thanksgiving, commemorating every 29th of May, that blasphemy against the Spirit and work of God, and celebrating that unhappy restoration of the rescinder of the Reformation, which had not only the concurrence of the universality of the nation, but, alas for the shame, that it should be told in Gath, etc., even of some ministers who afterwards accepted of the indulgence, one of which, a pillar among them, was seen scandalously dancing about the bonfires, and others who should have alarmed the whole nation, quasi pro aris and Photius, to rise for religion and liberty, to resist such wickedness, did wink at it. O how righteous is the Lord now in turning our harps into mourning, though, alas, we will not suffer ourselves to this day to see the shining righteousness of this retribution, and though we be scourged with scorpions and bewrayed in a mortar, our madness, our folly in these irreligious frolics is not yet acknowledged, let be lamented. Yet albeit neither in this day, when then the covenant was not only broken, but cast and declared of no obligation, or afterward, when it was burnt, for which Turks and pagans would have been ashamed and afraid at such a terrible sight, and for which the Lord's anger is burning against these bold burners, and against them who suffered it and did not witness against it? Was there any public testimony by protestation or remonstrance, or any public witness? Though the Lord had some then, and some who came out afterward with the trumpet at their mouth, whose heart then sorrowed at the fight, and some suffered for the sense they showed of that anniversary abomination, for not keeping which they lost both church and liberty. It is true the ordinary meetings of presbyteries and synods were about that time discharged, to make way for the exercise of the new power, conferred on the 4 prelates, who were at court reordained and consecrated thereby, renouncing their former title to the ministry. But this could not give a discharge from a necessary testimony, then called for, from faithful watchmen. However, the Reformation being thus rescinded and raised, and the house of the Lord pulled down, then they begin to build their Babel. In the Parliament 1662, by their first act, they restore and re-establish prelacy upon such a foundation as they might by the same law bring in popery, which was then designed, and so settled its harbinger, diocesan and Erastian prelacy, by fuller enlargement of the supremacy. The very act begins thus, quote, "For as much as the ordering and disposal of the external government of the Church doth properly belong to his Majesty, as an inherent right of the crown by virtue of his royal prerogative and supremacy in causes ecclesiastic, whatever shall be determined by his Majesty with advice of the archbishops and such of the clergy as he shall nominate in the external government of the Church, the same consisting with the standing laws of the kingdom, shall be valid and effectual. And in the same act all laws are rescinded by which the sole power and jurisdiction within the Church doth stand in the Church, assemblies, and all which may be interpreted to have given any church power, jurisdiction, or government to the office-bearers of the Church, other than that which acknowledges a dependence upon and subordination to the sovereign power of the king as supreme," unquote. By which prelates are redintegrated to all their privileges and preeminencies that they professed 1637. And all their church power, robbed from the officers of Christ, is made to be derived from, to depend upon, and to be subordinate to the crown prerogative of the king, whereby the king is made the only fountain of church power, and that exclusive even of Christ, of whom there is no mentioned exception, and his vassals, the bishops, as his clerks and ecclesiastics, are accountable to him for all their administrations. A greater usurpation upon the kingdom of Christ than ever the papacy itself aspired unto. Yet, albeit, here was another display of a banner of defiance against Christ in altering the church government of Christ's institution into the human invention of lordly prelacy, in assuming a power by prerogative to dispose then of the external government of the church, and in giving his creatures patents for this effect, to be his administrators for that usurped government. There was no public, ministerial, or at least united testimony against this, neither. Therefore the Lord punished the sinful and shameful silence of ministers in his holy justice, though by men's horrid wickedness, when by another wicked act of the council at Glasgow above 300 ministers were put from their charges, and afterwards for their nonconformity in not countenancing their diocesan meeting, and not keeping the anniversary day, May 29th, the rest were violently thrust from their labors in the Lord's vineyard, and banished from their parishes, and adjudged unto a nice and strange confinement 20 miles from their own parishes, 6 miles from a cathedral church, as they called it, and 3 miles from a burgh, whereby they were reduced into many inconveniences. Yet in this fatal convulsion of the church, generally all were struck with blindness and baseness that a paper proclamation made them all run from their posts and obey the king's orders for their ejection. Thus were they given up, because of their forbearing to sound an alarm, charging the people of God in point of loyalty to Christ, and under the pain of the curse of the covenant, to awake and acquit themselves like men, and not to suffer the enemy to rob them of that treasure of reformation which they were put in possession of by the tears, prayers, and blood of such as went before them. Instead of those prudential fumblings and firstlings then and since so much followed, wherefore the Lord in his holy righteousness left that enemy, against whom they should have cried and contended, and to whose eye they should have held the curse of the covenant, as having held it first in their own cause, in case of unfaithful silence and not holding it to his, to cast them out of the house of the Lord, and dissolve their assemblies, and deprive them of their privileges, because of their not being so valiant for the truth, as that a full and faithful testimony against that encroachment might be found upon record. Nevertheless, some were found faithful in that hour and power of darkness, who kept the word of the Lord's patience, and who were therefore kept in and from that temptation, which carried many away into sad and shameful defections, though not from suffering hard things from the hands of men. And only these, who felt most of their violence, found grace, helping them to acquit themselves suitably in that day's testimony, being thereby prevented from an active yielding to their impositions, when they were made passively to suffer force. However, that season of a public testimony was lost, and as to the most part, never recovered to this day. The prelates being settled and readmitted to voice in Parliament, they procure an act dogmatically condemning several material parts and points of our covenanted Reformation, to wit, these positions, quote, that it was lawful for subjects for reformation or necessary self-defense to enter into leagues, to take up arms against the king, and particularly declaring that the National Covenant, as explained in the year 1638, and the Solemn Leaguing Covenant were and are in themselves unlawful covenants, and were taken up by and imposed upon the subjects of this kingdom against the fundamental laws and liberties thereof. And that all such gatherings and petitions that were used in the beginning of the late troubles were unlawful and seditious, and whereas then people were led unto these things, by having disseminated among them such principles as these, that it was unlawful to come with petitions and representations of grievances to the king, that it was unlawful for people to restrict their allegiance under such and such limitations, and suspend it until he should give security for religion, etc. It was therefore enacted that all such positions and practices founded thereupon were treasonable, and further did enact that no person by writing, praying, preaching, or malicious or advised speaking, express or publish any words or sentences to stir up the people to dislike of the king's prerogative and supremacy, or of the government of the church by bishops, or justify any of the deeds, actings, or things declared against by that act, unquote. Yet notwithstanding of all this subversion of religion and liberty, and restraint of asserting these truths, here trampled upon either before men by testimony, or before God in mourning over these indignities done unto them, in averting these and all the parts of reformation, even when it came to Daniel's case of confession, preaching and praying truths interdicted by law, few had their eyes open, let be their windows in an open avouching them, to see the duty of the day calling for a testimony. Though afterwards the Lord spirited some to assert and demonstrate the glory of these truths and duties to the world, as that judicious author of the apologetic relation, whose labors need no eulogium to commend them. But this is not all, for these men, having now, as they thought, subverted the work of God, they provided also against the fears of its revival, making acts declaring, quote, that if the outed ministers dare to continue to preach and presume to exercise their ministry, they should be punished as seditious persons, requiring of all a due acknowledgment of and hearty compliance with the king's government, ecclesiastical and civil, and that whosoever shall ordinarily and willfully withdraw and absent from the ordinary meetings for divine worship in their own churches on the Lord's Day shall incur the penalties there insert, unquote. Thus, the sometimes chaste virgin, whose name was Beulah to the Lord, the Reformed Church of Scotland, did now suffer a violent and villainous rape from a vermin of violent and vile schismatic apostates, obtruded and opposed upon her, instead of her able, painful, faithful, and successful pastors that the Lord had set over her, and now by their faintness and the enemy's force robbed from her. And none now allowed by law to administer the ordinances, but either apostate curates, who by their perjury and apostasy forfaulted their ministry, or other hirelings and prelates journeymen, who run without a mission, except from them who had none to give according to Christ's institution, the seal of whose ministry could never yet be shown in the conversation of any sinner to Christ. But if the tree may be known by its fruits, we may know whose ministers they are. Ut ex ungue leonem. By their conversations of reformation into deformation, by the work and cause of God into the similitude of the Roman beast, of ministers into hirelings, of their proselytes into 10 times worse children of the devil than they were before, of the power of godliness into formality, of preaching Christ into ornations of morality, of the purity of Christ's ordinances into the vanity of men's inventions, of the beautiful government of the house of God for edification, to a lordly preeminence and domination over consciences, in a word, of church and state constitutions for religion and liberty, all upside down into wickedness and slavery. These are the conversions of prelacy. But now this astonishing blow to the gospel of the kingdom, introducing such a swarm of locusts into the church, and enforcing a compliance of the people with this defection, and that so violently and rigorously as even simple withdrawing was so severely punished by severe edicts or fining, and other arbitrary punishments at first, what did it produce? Did it awaken all Christ's ambassadors now to appear for Christ in this clear and clement case of confessing him, and for freedom and purity of his ordinances? Alas, the backwardness and bentness to backsliding and a superseding from the duties of that day did make it evident that now the Lord had in a great measure forsaken them, because they had forsaken him.